Good evening, everyone. My name is Peter Murray, Director of the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, with a little buzz in there. I would like to welcome you this lovely, lovely evening. I hope you've had a chance to see the exhibition, and I hope you've had a chance to visit the shop, and that you will also visit the shop before you leave. One of the reasons why you should visit the shop is because we've just got this wonderful, wonderful publication about Tony's exhibition. It's a fantastic record of the exhibition. It literally only arrived today, and it costs £25, and it is amazing, amazing value. It's a wonderful, wonderful snip. The other advantage of buying it today is that Tony will do a book signing at the end of the talk. So don't forget to take a copy with you, because tomorrow, you never know, there won't be any left. This has been an extraordinary journey for the Yorkshire Sculpture Park in terms of working with Tony Cragg. I think you will agree that the exhibition we've put together with Tony is quite amazing. It's the most sensational exhibition. You go in there on a weekend, you go in there every day. People are looking. And it's that sort of exhibition. It makes you really, really look and really think about what sculpture is all about. Tony Cragg in the late 70s changed the way we think about sculpture when he transformed plastic and waste material into sculptural images. In the 1990s, with his series, Rational Beings, he again changed the way we think and look at sculpture. And as I've just mentioned, as can be seen in this Yorkshire Sculpture Park exhibition, he continues to extend our understanding as he conjures up new realities. 40 years ago, 1977, the Yorkshire Sculpture Park started. The same year, I think it was just a coincidence, Tony left the country. It wasn't a coincidence. and went to live in Germany, and is still living in Germany. He's been there for 40 years. So that strange coincidence has resulted in Tony's exhibition, which is here not only to celebrate sculpture, but to celebrate 40 years of activity at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. We couldn't have had a better exhibition. We couldn't have had a better artist. Tony has done so much to create an international interest and reputation in sculpture through his teaching, through his writing, through his thinking, through his drawing, but most of all, through his sculpture. His work can be seen in almost every major collection in the country. He's exhibited everywhere, and we are so, so delighted that one of his best exhibitions has taken place here in Yorkshire. And it gives me great, great privilege and pleasure to introduce Tony Cragg, who's going to talk to you this evening. Thank you.
So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I think a transparent podium is really a bit mean, actually. You can see my nervous fidgeting behind the thing here. Okay, so. I was born in Liverpool in 1949, and my father was an engineer who worked in the aircraft industry. And so as a consequence, I actually went to 7 schools, and we seem to have continually moved around the country in the whole course of my childhood. When I left school, I worked for a while. I developed an interest in nature, and for a while I wanted to be a farmer, like my grandfather was. It's the last thing my father wanted to be. And then I was also interested in geology and other things like that. And when I left school, I worked for a while in a laboratory in Welwyn Garden City, and as a lab assistant. And in that time, it was 1968, 69, they were very, obviously we all know, very dramatic, interesting, dynamic years. and I was stuck in quite a smelly laboratory with a lot of old men. Wasn't the old men, it was the chemicals. And so I, without having any sort of knowledge actually how to do this, I started to draw and to pass. There were no computers, and at that in the 60s, all of the work was done by notation, timing, and whatever. So it's a very long thing. So I spent my evenings and weekends in the laboratory, and drawing seemed to be a way of passing the time. And after a while, the drawing became much more interesting for me to do than actually concentrating on the experiments, much to the chagrin of the professor I was working for. And at some point, I mean, I was only 20 years old, and it seemed like it would be a good idea to go to art school and find out a little bit more about drawing. So I I applied to art school in Cheltenham and went there. And it was a very, if you like, academic or traditional course, very good teachers. And we made prints and we made ceramics. And at one point in the course of the year, they said, "Oh, next week you'll be making. There's a sculpture course, so you'll be making a sculpture." And I thought, "Oh God." Anyway, but I, of course, being a true believer, on Monday morning at 9 o'clock in the morning in art school, then we had to actually sign in to say that we're actually there, which is something I tried to introduce at the Academy in Düsseldorf. It didn't really work very well, especially as I actually wanted it for the professors, but that didn't work at all. And so I started on the Monday morning to work with some materials that were in a sort of old broom cupboard or something, and strange enough, after a few hours, it just became totally absorbed with what I was doing. Just watching the material move, watching the silhouette, the lines, the volume, surface quality. And I realized it's very, very similar to the drawing. It was immediate. As soon as you did something with it, I had an idea or I had an emotion about it. And I realized, well, if there was a fundamental thing that happened to me in my life, it was probably those few weeks in that period of time, but I didn't really understand it, and I didn't change my course. I wanted to learn to draw, and I went then to Wimbledon School of Art on a painting course. In that summer, I worked in a foundry, and in the foundry, it was an industrial foundry making metal motor cases, and in that period of time, which was a night shift, and it was a fantastic experience, a big black hall full of people making molds on one side, casting metal, and then the casts moving down a long sort of serpentine on a chain and then coming out at the other end at some point, sort of being shaken into the ground. On one side, big pile of glowing red metal casts, and on the other side, an ever-growing huge black cone of casting sand. And it was, although it was quite diabolic, it actually looked fantastically beautiful, and it was a very exciting thing to do. And after I've done that in the summer, as a summer job for 3 months, I went to my new art school, my new study in Wimbledon, and we were 32 people in a studio, all behind easels. And I thought, oof, this isn't really actually as exciting as the foundry. And so I started to just take very simple materials and just do something very easy with it, just tying little knots in pieces of string, making big piles of string. And I think I really did it because I just didn't know what else to do. And I wasn't trying to be clever, it just seemed to be, and I took the string and spread it around and put it in my small flat and put it around the studio, took photographs of it. And I realized it was very immediate. I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, everything one does, moving material around, we're used to looking at each other, and when you look at somebody's faces, it's very subtle movements of form, and we react very strongly to a smile or a grimace or So we read form with an enormous accuracy, and we know that. But in fact, the whole world affects us in that way as well. And really, that's what I started to realize, even with very, very simple materials. And then at that point, then I went down to the sculpture department at some point, because working in a painting studio with other students was quite difficult. And I went down and showed them what I'd done. And they're very nice. They shook their heads and they said, "Tony Cragg, I don't know what you think you've been doing, but it's certainly not sculpture. So go back to the painting department." So I trotted back to the painting department. But I was very lucky because I had very good, very liberal and very friendly people there. People like Roger Ackling and Jim Rogers are very good young teachers. And so I just continued to make my work, and I saw myself in a kind of, as an agent for moving simple materials. And that time, late 60s, early 70s in Britain was perhaps, and it's got something to do with the fact that I became so enthusiastic about sculpture, not just my own experience of it. It was an amazing time because obviously Henry Moore was in the background with the whole generation of Hepworth and everybody else, and Armitage and Paolozzi, many other artists of a certain older generation, post-war generation. But then at the same time, there'd been already a new movement with Anthony Caro and Philip King and 50 other metal welding sculptors, so there was something there. And in the late 60s, and before I started to study, there'd already been another movement in St Martin's School of Art with people like Barry Flanagan, Richard Long, Gilbert and George, and Bruce MacLean, many, many others. So Britain was a very, very dynamic, in itself, a very dynamic scene, and it was something I learned about quite rapidly. I was very lucky, and I became friends through Roger Ackling with Richard Long and a couple of those other artists. And I participated, or I sort of became aware of not just what is happening in Britain, but of also what was happening internationally. There's pop art, obviously, was still reverberating, arty pulver, minimalism. The exhibition, When Attitudes Become Form, of Harold Seaman, Conceptual Land Art. There's an endless list of new forms and activities, a lot of new form, a lot of new content. And also the dialogue, if you like, or the arguments that took place. And they were quite dramatic. I mean, sculptors being sculptors, it didn't always stay at sort of abusive language. It also broke into fisticuffs sometimes. It was quite physical. And and it was a very classical argument. You can hear it today just the same. One side was the argument accused the other of relying too heavily on historical content, of being academic, of only being about form and devoid of content. And the more traditional sculptors replying that the ideas were shallow and the artist's work were purely novelty for novelty's sake, and that the material forms were unimaginative, simple, unskilled arrangements and left too much to chance. So there's really, over the last 45 years, not very much changed in that regard. And that's not an argument we're going to be able to resolve today as well. So but I'm not going to be able to resolve that problem anyway. But the fact there was this very dynamic and quite forceful debate or dialogue is significant. It was very significant. And to my point of view then as now, that there is no content without a form, and there are no forms without a content. That still doesn't solve the problem. But the dynamic of that situation was impressive. And when one thinks of sculpture, one very often thinks of statue, something static, not moving, not very changing. And that is exactly what was not the case. In fact, the sculpture has, at that time, and has continued to be, an incredibly dynamic development or evolution, if you like, of material. And especially in the fact, if one thinks about you have to go back a little bit in history, but at the beginning of the 19th century, you think of sculpture in Europe, at a time where painting, music, and literature did amazing things, all the greatest literature and music that's ever been created, and sculpture, one has to say, in the 19th century was really nothing. It was very just the human figure, very few materials, and very related to crafts and controlled by, the reason for that, it was controlled by the academies. And sculptors, unlike some people that just need a pencil and paper, sculptors do need material, energy, time, space, and all the other things to actually make their work. And the academies of the 19th century controlled greatly. And that's really the origin of the word academic. It came out of that control that they exercised over artists' activities at that time. The materials were limited to very materials which were quite homogenic and being able to use in a craftsman-like manner, that you could make sort of relatively accurate anatomic representations. But during the 19th century, there was a slow transition, as always. It can only happen with individual artists. First of all, Mayol, of course, fantastic, sort of making the figure, actually stopping, representing muscles, sinews, veins, hair, and everything, and making the figure more into a sort of rounding it up into a composition of geometric forms. And Rousseau, very important, because he actually gave the material as being something that the way we look at each other, the material, small, modest forms, but you actually read the sculpture in the same way we look at each other and read each other's expressions, and was an acceptance of the fact, an impression that the surface we see is only an impression. It's not a real thing. We have no idea really we have no true image of what the surface is really like. And so it relativizes our perceptions of the material. And of course, at the same time, Rodin, with his sort of virtuoso ability, his genius, and at the time of where Freud was introducing psychology and letting the world know about the sort of subconsciousness and other drives, and the simple fact that the reason for some form is not geometric and it's not just physic, it's also psychological, and his desire to have form not necessarily precisely anatomically represented, but expressing emotion. So he would actually sort of traumatize the material in some ways. And in some ways he showed the limit of what the figure could do. And at the same time, enormous flow of art from Asia and Africa and other things also, of course, that had their influence on that time. Brancusi, coming from Romania, not being necessarily representative, his conversion from a classical European sculptor to a modern sculptor that has led the way to what we call, properly, erroneously, abstraction. And artists like Tatlin, who completely got rid of the figure and just showed structures in space, and in the way their representation of material triumphing over gravity as a metaphor, if you like, for human existence, opening up another channel for a sculpture to be. And at the end, so in a sense, by 1920, there will be 3 different methods of making sculpture. And the traditional way of molding, modeling, and whatever, carving, and then there was the constructive way of doing things, and then, which obviously was being taken up by Caro and others. And then, very importantly, of course, there was the idea of people naming. Duchamp coming along and saying, giving us, first of all, something to provoke the sort of French bourgeoisie, a pissoir, because it was, but what he did with that was much more significant than just, he opened the door to a world of man-made objects and industrial-made objects that have flown during the course of the 20th century into the usage in art. And more importantly, I think with Duchamp, not just giving us new materials and objects to work with, his gesture almost gave us an insight into the relationship between material and language. So, sorry, a bit of art history, so don't bore anybody with that, but these were essentially, that is what I was being confronted with when I was a student, because all of these possibilities were there. And whatever was happening in the first half of the 20th century, they all seem to diverge into the arguments and to the complex situation that it was really coming to a head around the late 60s and early 70s. Basically what has happened, that sculpture has moved away from being something that's representing the human figure with a relative accurate anatomy, and it has become a discipline that is concerned with all forms of material and their meaning. And one could say, in a sense, that sculpture, in its most general sense, sculpture is how material and material form affects us. I feel that it was an amazing chance of my life, and in a sense a privilege to have started to become interested in sculpture at that time. And I was in 1973. I could study in the Royal College in the sculpture department, which is a fantastic building. I had more space and whatever. And the great thing about that, it was in Queensgate, South Kensington, and it was actually. We shared the backyard with the Natural History Museum and the Geological Museum, so it was a fantastic. I can't remember really going to many lectures on art history, but I do remember spending most of my time. We were allowed to go through the back door into these museums and spending a great deal of my time just looking at the exhibits in those museums. And I don't want to be. I'm reminded with Henry Moore saying very glibly when he was once asked about his inspiration, saying, well, inspiration, I don't really need it. I've got Picasso in the British Museum. And so that's John Wood. Thank you for that quote, John. And then I don't want to be glib about it, but I mean, my inspiration was really, sculpture and walking around those museums in the same way. But Moore's quote on that is significant, because it really is the case that the first half of the 20th century was very much art was influenced in Europe by Picasso. And definitely after the Second World War and into the second part of the 20th century, art was influenced by Duchamp. And I was there, I was starting my work at late 60s and very much in that period where one was under his influence. And one can see that pop art, Fluxus, Arti Pulvera, Zero, concept art, minimal art, and land art were all in their essence movements that were relative to the ready-made in some form or another. They use the things. I say land art because land art is a kind of big ready-made that you can't actually move into the museum or into the gallery, but artists took documentations of nature and brought it into the museums. And these were the first presentations of Richard Long's work and others. That was the first representation of photography in contemporary as a form of documenting the outside world, as a kind of proxy ready-made, if you like. However, the process of rushing through the world, artists finding a new material or a new object to bring into the art world, which is something that at some point in the world seemed to be what a lot of artists were doing. In a finite world, it comes to an end. At least by the late 80s, I've seen enough BMWs in museums, which is sort of posing as sculptures and other things, that you realise it's really this process of, if you like, nomination of artists bringing the non-art world into the art world was coming to an end, and that was something that one felt in the 70s as a young sculptor. And there were people I've known Richard Deacon since 1970, and Bill Woodrow and many other sculptors, and that was a concrete development that we knew that there was something happening there. We weren't intelligent enough to actually be able to talk about it then, but it was a feeling that we want to express in our own work. When I'm talking about, and when I say about the relationship of language and materials, which really affected everybody's work at that time, it's perhaps necessary to say what I mean about that. I mean, things as we know them, they have a three-dimensional extension in space and in time. And that's their, if you like, that's their physical existence. But when you turn away from them, they also have an existence in our minds. We have an image of those things, so a set of terms, a colour, a form, a shape, a reference. And so those terms that we carry around with us in our heads, which are related to things. So any object one sees, one can regard as its physical being, but it also has, if you like, a cloud of meaning around it. And this was, if you like, its metaphysical existence, but it's at least what we had in our minds about this thing. And artists realized over the course of the years that one could actually take an object and you could completely change its meaning. You could totally transform an object by simply changing the terms and around associated to that physical object. And that's perhaps the principle of what we call the ready-made, which has had such a great influence in sculpture making in the last 120 years. So we got used to seeing sort of soup cans and rabbit's feet, fluorescent light bulbs, igloos, and even later on sharks. I mean, and it's interesting, even if you see the development, I mean, it starts with very simple materials and very primary, and it gets more and more complicated, but also at the end, I mean, someone like Damien Hirst, I think, does a very valid job. At the end of the 20th century, most everything's been used up, so he brought nature into art. And the main problems are presentation and conservation and representation. So it's a very valid statement at the end of a process. But one really felt that things were moving. So this process has brought an enormous amount of materials. Perhaps everything possible can be used to make art with. And then with that, with all the different new materials, new techniques and methods, a lot of new forms, out of all areas of human existence and content. And in a sense, that critical moment, and it continues today as well, is this inflow of the real world into art was an enormous dramatic thing. I mean, we see it on the surface of things, that things have changed, art has changed. But it required an enormous amount of definition and redefinition. In the 60s and 70s, everybody says, is it art? You know, but nowadays, nobody actually says, is it art? You know, they know, we know it's art. We know we've got used to that idea, or it's meant in an artistic context. But in that early period of the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of redefinition, a lot of categorization, a lot of analysis of ideas and even theories, and the fact that conceptual art was very strong or very prevalent at that time is an indication of this need for an intellectual achievement that accompanied the physicality of sculpture. And so artists had this fantastic, if you like, expansion. It was real world and art world became almost like covering one another, and it meant that it had made art available over the last 30 and 40 years to an enormous public. You know, and as I remember going to art galleries and museums in the 70s, and it's no exaggeration. I said this when on the opening day that when Nick Sorota was here, and I said, well, you know, and the funny thing is, the art world really consisted of it was always the same 50 or 100 people every time you went there, and you know, all the artists would say, it'd be great if, you know, more people would be involved, and that if art could have an influence in society. Little did they know how that would develop. But and I said that to Nicholas. Nicholas Rose said, no, you're exaggerating totally. That's not true. I think it was about 20 people. And I think that's and it's true. I've been to Whitechapel openings, and there have been like 20 people there, and that was it. So art and life became very close, even to the point that everything was art at some point, and the human figure was an art. So we have Gilbert and George becoming artists in themselves. The mantle became a physical mantle over themselves. This approximation, this change of approximation of art material and real life material brought an enormous amount of confusion. I said, people saying, is it art or not? I mean, that's a boring question. You could use it if you like, but it's after a while, it's not such a sort of satisfactory strategy to just provoke if one wants. And there was a need for interpretation and consensus. And this opened the door again to an enormous host of ideologies, doctrines, and orthodox formulations, this time not from the church or the state, but from ascending new class of art mediators and critics who have become the, if you like, the high priests of our culture. And they cultivate, unfortunately, it's a tendency in the viewer to rely not on their experience of the artwork, but they become indoctrinated and look at art with their ears rather than their eyes. My work, as I've described already, started with very, very simple working processes. I had absolutely no craftsman skills. I didn't know how to mold, model, carve, or anything, and I wasn't even interested in doing that, because I found that you didn't have to do that. The things I found on the ground, the things that I'd found as a boy in the fossils and the geology, they moved me, and I knew that innate that I didn't have to represent anything. I didn't have to mimic nature in any sense. And I was, for a while, the simple processes and the reduction of things sufficed me. I was then almost automatically, in a sense, drawn to minimalism. And as a sort of, in 1970, 72, stared for hours at a sort of pile of bricks, embarrassingly enough, or Don Judd sculptures, or the Solar Wit, and all the artists of that period. I felt that was a really very fundamental moment in art. But I realized also very shortly after that it wasn't my generation. This was a generation that was sort of slightly older than myself. And this statement in art, I mean, a lot of it was sort of looking at Don Judd and minimalism. I mean, I was basically looking at this very pure, very fantastically made industrial objects made in a country that was actually bombing people that lived in bamboo houses. And it made me wanted to sort of really react against geometry, to destroy the industrial nature of the things that they'd been making, and I looked for further ground. So I started to make things by stacking them up and by crushing them and doing very simple working processes with them, which are not usually, let's say, sculptural hand crafts. And one thing I've always been interested in is man-made material. I think that's a pretty constant in my work, whether it's bronze, glass, plastic or plywood. These are not natural materials. Nature's too grand. I mean, nature's made all the most wonderful things, and I'm not going to get. I'm more concerned with what we make, if you like, what I can make, and looking at man-made materials and looking how they're used in our industry and how we use all the materials in an enormous expansion, our culture, if you like, of things. We build, we put clothes on, sit on furniture in buildings, on roads and cities. So it has enormous use of material, our culture. And all of this is a very, very, if you like, this utilitarian use of material seems, for the great part, to be very simple and very repetitive, and quite a lot of it is quite unintelligent. And when I was making things with bits of plastic, for example, I realized that this material, if you really looked at it, it was just because industry uses the most economic ways of doing it. It was the most simplest of geometries, flat, straight-edged, right angle, circular, whatever. It was very, very, very simple, very repetitive. And that is really basically what we do, is we make very lowest common denomination decisions about the forms of things, economic decisions about things. And in that, I saw a chance for sculpture, because sculpture is the reverse. Because one thing it isn't, it's not economic. And it's not utilitarian. So in my world, sculpture, I don't like sculpture you can sit on and eat off and all those things. I really think sculpture is useless. I don't want to have any function for the work other than it having the opportunity to be freed of any commitment to anything else other than being what it is, and taking off and moving into space and being something like in nature, something we've created. And in doing that, it produces completely, to my own, it's a rare use of materials and it's a rare activity, if you like. So it gives this special role of sculpture, actually gives new forms to materials. It brings new thoughts, it brings us new dreams, new fantasies, and new language, and ultimately it gives us new freedoms. And I think that's the great thing, not just about sculpture, but that's really what art is about. It opens our lives, it enriches our lives, it opens our minds, it gives us more language, gives us better quality in our thoughts and fantasies. So sculpture exploits the primacy of the material reality, which is all-pervading and omnipotent source of our own existence. So does, of course, science. But science is the major activity that sort of dictates a lot of the stuff that's around us. And that is, in a way, science only ever indicates to us that there is a material basis behind everything. In fact, everything we know is material or material phenomena of material. And it doesn't just provide us with our physical being. It's not just reality we can eat off the plate and build our own bodies, but this material reality around us, everything around from the minute we're born, also provides us with, through the information we see through our eyes, hear through our ears, take into our mouths, touch and feel, this contact with material actually forms every idea, every term and every word. Every single part of our vocabulary is grounded in the material world around us. And we spend our lives using our senses, gathering information, filling our heads with thoughts and ideas and emotions. So this intense relationship between material and our thoughts and emotions plays a very important and is really the evolutionary basis of sculpture and art making. As I said, we're very good, and we have an amazing ability at reading material. We know, if you look at someone sitting next to you or someone you know or love, you can read the smallest flimmer of movement in their lips, in their eyes, or whatever, coloration and everything. So we are incredibly accurate at reading material. And we can get not just ideas, but real emotions and real insights into the material in front of us. And that doesn't just apply to faces, where it becomes very critical. It also applies to our physical stance. So this is why the body, the pose we take, we're reading that constantly in all in our lives. And that is what we're doing with everything. And mostly, of course, unconsciously, but it's the floor, the ceiling, the color, the sky, everything around us is impinging into our minds and changing our thoughts and changing our emotions and forming our emotions. This is what we really are. And perhaps, in a sense, there is a sort of development of material, and we as kind of if there's a hierarchy of material, we have very special, very highly developed material we call neurons that all sort of bunch together in the top of our bodies up here somewhere, called our brain. And this is perhaps one of the most highly, at least in the minds of a neurologist, it is the most highly developed material, because this material is exactly the material that makes everything else. If you like, this material, the human neuron, is what actually it provides us with the possibility to create a dimension that makes everything for us perceivable and conceptual. It's very difficult in that sense. So if we have a hierarchy that's perhaps slightly irrelevant, could have crossed it out, but I mean, maybe in that sense it gives us a sort of responsibility in our sense, possessing this material for most of the materials around us, on animal, vegetable, mineral. And so it's quite unfair to compare what nature, nature's had a very long time to make everything, and so we shouldn't judge ourselves. It's a miracle that we can make anything at all. But it is a pity that we make such poor things. I mean, survival strategies oblige us to act in a certain way, but we are responsible for impoverishing the form on this planet. We've destroyed most of the species of creatures on this planet. And, we take a forest, we cut it down. In a forest, you have to say a square meter of forest has probably got more form in it than a whole damn city sometimes, And so, but we take down the forest and we make it into a field, and it's a cornfield or whatever. And then after a while, we change the field into a car park. And that is irreversible process that we are responsible for. Our clever material is responsible for impoverishing the form on this planet. And that doesn't just apply to the materiality of the things around us. It also equally applies to the architecture and to our social systems, our education system, many other systems. We don't live to the potential, the amazing facilities we have to actually realize, consciously realize our own existence is very sadly, in most of people's humdrum lives, just going through their day, isn't realized. Art does offer that possibility to overcome the moribund surreality of our everyday existence and try and find richer experiences for us. Art, other than that, is useless. It shouldn't be utilitarian. It's very important in my point of view. And in doing this, it allows artists to discover forms that are possibly, they have the possibility to express new emotions and ideas and give us new language and images. And what most artists, in doing that, what most artists discover is it's a little complicated, I fumble this sometimes, but I really want to say it correctly. What most artists discover is there are many more things that do not exist than things that do exist. And whether they can be meaningful or not is another question, but first we have to make them to take a look at them. And that is why it's not important to copy nature as back in the past, or even to produce copying the industry of our present time. It's important for us to discover, to progress and discover the things we cannot see and haven't experienced that yet. And the little bit of reality that we do see, I'm of a great conviction, and one can see it historically. People 100 years ago saw the same trees we saw, and they didn't know about its chemistry, its ecology, its evolution. So we have an enormous amount of information. So we are aware that the reality we see is just a very, very limited reality. We're really seeing just the tip of the iceberg in a very relatively stable reality around us. The work I made in the early 80s was extremely important to me, finding things and doing stuff with materials, all the stuff I could get my hands on, because it actually provided me with the subject and themes that have been central to my work, the work I'm making today. In a sense, sometimes I think people ask me, "Oh, there's been a great change or something," and I think no. These materials, my experiences with materials, provided me with if you like, a dictionary or compendium that I still refer to daily in my work, and once again, to return to this, by the middle of in my own work, I said in the middle of the 70s, I think young artists really felt that sort of the ready-made strategy was becoming tired. But definitely, in my own experience, I had the opportunity to do a lot of exhibitions at the end of the 70s and into the early 80s, where I could travel the world and almost performatively make my work. Quite exhaustingly. I think 1981, I made 12 exhibitions in 1 year, which cost me my marriage and a lot of nerves. And I realized that at a certain point that I couldn't get any further with what I was actually doing in the limitations of an installation. And I kept standing there with things, and if I wanted to get further, I'd have to do something more with the material. And exactly that idea this is one thing and that's another thing, but what is all the form in between them? When we see animals out in the park here, we can see sheep and cows, but what is the myriad of creatures that could exist between them if the genetic material would be possible and given the right niche? But that's the feeling I have, that we actually live in a world where the points of reality, the things around us, are a very, very limited number of things. There is an enormous amount of stuff that's actually missing. And I think sculpture, the work I made, which I call early forms, which are the development of one known volume into another, was a very naive, simple attempt, first of all, to just make a form that sat between the thing. This is the pig, this is the elephant. I was looking for the piggyphant. And that's in a sense. I think that's what the sculptors are doing. We're looking for the species that doesn't exist, because it's just as meaningful. And in our literature, we all have dragons and fantasy things anyway. So there are many, many other things that we have to just, through sculpture and through art, one will be able to do. And early forms even continues today. It's something I thought I was going to give up many times. I've got to the end of the line of that. But having made it, I realized, my God, it could do this and it could do that, and I keep developing the work. And it's probably indicative of the fact that I'm not a conceptual artist. I'm not someone that kind of wastes too much time sitting down thinking about what I should be doing in the future. My work is based on drawing, it's based on modeling, it's based on working with material and seeing right back to my very first thing I ever made and the work I made in Wimbledon, looking at the material, feeling what could be done with it, what the material suggested to me, learning from the material. And I think that's something which I think is very essential for my way of doing things. And just the simple the fact that in a long process of decision making, I have the material in front of me and I move, the material moves, I look at it and respond and move again, and it moves. And and the worst thing is, if you ever, I don't know how many sculptors are here in the room, but we all know if you really want to challenge yourself, sit down with a big lump of clay, and every move you make will be registered in that clay. And that is one of the most frightening things you can possibly do. And that's a great demonstration. You can go out into this field and you can dig up a nice fat block of clay, which is down there somewhere. Nobody knows it's there excepting a geologist and the sheep and the farmer. But you take it into a studio and an artist stands in front of the piece of clay, moves it, and it moves, and he moves, and he moves it again. And around 11 o'clock he goes off for a coffee, and somebody else comes into the studio and sees that dumb piece of clay and will have emotion and ideas and have real notions from just looking at that piece of clay. And it's the transference of intelligence, of human intelligence into the material. That is exactly what sculpture is and art is about. And it's very often the case that when I'm actually working with material, changing its form with my hands, that I know that it's the material that's changing my mind. I can feel that the changes that take place are in my head are equally, if not more important than what I'm doing with my hands. So making art is, for me, an adventure. It's one that I embark upon very often without knowing what the final destiny will be, but it's an adventure. And the limits, it's limitless. It's almost impossible to describe its scope. If one considers a piece of paper with two spots on it, and you join the two spots with a simple line, well, that's one option. But you could also do a curve, or maybe a double curve, or maybe go around the page, or off the page, or around the room, or across the field, maybe leave this country, leave the planet, leave the universe. Still the tension of joining up two spots. So you see, there is an infinite number of ways of joining two spots on a piece of paper. I'll go back to the block of clay. If I was given a 10-kilogram block of clay and I was God, I can make anything out of it. He did, he made us. So we know where the reference is. But so if you could make, what is the point? You can make infinite number of things, but art, humanity, is about finding what is significant in the forms. And there's a very nice, I don't want to teach anybody German here, but there's very in German, there's a thing called Dichtung, where meaning accumulates in a certain concentration of things. And poetry is about exactly that, using material. And poesis, Greek term, is to when you use material to create something that's never been there before. And it's obviously the origin of poetry, but it's to actually create things in a material that give us a new sense of meaning. So it's not just the wide open spaces where there's not so much meaning, it's where things come to be concentrated and have a special value to us. So it's about making choices. And in making choices, we have what we call an evaluation system, if you like, an aesthetics, the aesthetics of decisions, the judgments we make. And this is obviously aesthetics, or making judgments, spot decisions about everything we do, as we do, is something that is fundamental to our survival. And we choose the material that is based, there's really our choice of material is based on aesthetics. Everything we do, the people we spend time with, get married to, whatever, the landscapes we live in, the objects we put around us, the painting, the pictures we have on our wall, everything is about, it's putting material around us that we feel is beneficial for our existence. So it's part of a survival strategy. And even beautiful and ugly are in fact only very relative terms. And one notices that very much when one is making things. And they are related to such terms as good and bad, and in turn that leads us to right and wrong and moral and ethical systems. The equation of truth and beauty is of ultimate truth and beauty is full of self-delusions. And these decisions are much more automatic and predetermined than we would like to imagine. Materialism is, for some, a dirty word. The basis for that, or the reason for that, is generally that there have been centuries of abusive dialogue between theologians and philosophers, and theologians were very concentrated on actually proving that materialism was very something cheap, not particularly, not spiritual in any case. This, unfortunately, belies the fact that we more and more learn more and more about the material, that the materiality, the material around us, is unimaginably complex and sublime. We're not anywhere in the area of understanding absolute reality. And the material reality around us, we have to look at the word materia, comes from mother. Mater comes from mother, and it's about that which nurtures us. It is that which supports us physically, intellectually, and it's that which carries us. So as a sculptor, I mean, where the hell would I be? Wouldn't have much to do without material. So everything I see around me is material, or the phenomena of material. And while physics continues to unravel its complexities into areas that can barely be grasped by mathematicians, and where language starts to fail us, we're here in our own material form with our perceptions of reality that even in our own vicinity is infinitely complex and sublime. Life, intelligence, and emotions are phenomena of material. When I think about a marble head, you see all those people walking around museums looking at sculpture, marble head. I wonder sometimes, a marble head? You mean a chunk of homogeneous piece of stone for this fantastic thing we have on top of our bodies? That's an amazing way. I don't know what's really so admirable about it sometimes. But as a sculptor, obviously, I'm almost by definition a materialist. Science describes how material develops in time, from an energetic nuclear soup to subnuclear particles, atoms, molecules, organic molecules, living molecules, and thinking molecules. And I think this is a very sculptural, the idea of large organic molecules lolling around on the early planet, lolling around in tepid puddles, being nudged into shape by their neighbors and radiation, and taking on various forms. I think it's a very sculptural concept. You have to think about it. Every new shape they took on, they're actually a new substance with a new potential for reactions and a new meaning, with a new name and new properties and a new effect on their surroundings. And it's this science that provides us with so many new things that we cannot perceive, and for which we have little language and little chance to imagine them. Atomic particles, viruses, photons, energy forms. Just to be clear, art is not science. Art that parodies science is vacuous. Art does not conduct controlled experiments and use rational analysis in order to understand the laws and properties of our reality. But what art does do, it gives more intensive associative language, meaning, value, and even a sense of existence
Science is meaningless without art. Science dominates our world, but artists and poets were the first on the moon, the first at the bottom of the oceans, first in outer space, first traveling in time, practicing non-invasive healing and teletransportation. And that is the basis that we continue. Information is substituted for experience and perception, and our world has become more and more invisible. So we have to search for models and mental pictures. Finally, that what's in front of us is only a projection of our own intelligent material. Human intelligence is a dimension. We have long accepted that as individuals, we do not have much control over the cosmos, and the advanced physics of our times has not just relativized our existence in the big scheme of things, it has totally marginalized it. But we see things out of our perspective, leaving us with big pictures and small pictures. We know how irrelevant we are, but we see it from our own perspective. But we try to keep a balance, keep our sanity and keep a balance in the... We hold onto the truths and facts we establish beyond reasonable doubt. Science continues to challenge even those truths. Of course, we hope we know certain things, but beyond the horizon of our knowledge, we all have to believe. And in fact, we may know very little, but therefore belief is an essential part of human existence. Because nobody's knowledge is limited. Because everybody's knowledge is limited, and beyond knowledge, all we have to rely on is what we believe. Knowledge is historically always incomplete. Beliefs are founded in the realm of the unknown, where there are few, if any, concrete facts, and therefore it is highly improbable, in my point of view, it's highly improbable that any two people believe the same thing, and in fact, it hardly seems worth arguing about. It is therefore not surprising that so many images are produced, not just of the unknown, but often of the unknown and even impossible. Fantasies, religion, speculations, and visions. We pride ourselves with our superior intelligence, but the vast majority of our decisions are made not on logical basis, but on emotional basis. It is often emotion that causes motion. The basic aesthetic descriptions of the physical world as being organic or geometric infer two very different worlds. We all look relatively organic, but without geometry, we could not exist. Our molecules, cells, organs, bones, they all rely on basic geometries. And this provides us with a classic dichotomy of rational and emotional, of intellect and feeling, of the spirit versus the visceral. Apollo and Dionysus have endured since the origins of our philosophy. And they form two facets of human nature that we are all, every day in our existences, aware of. But things are only the result. We see things by the grace of the light. We see things by a grace of the light as reflected from the surface of the things around us. But things are only the result of internal forces and pressures. The form of the sun, or our own figure, is the result of billions of simultaneous reactions. And I believe there is an enormous psychological pressure to see underneath the surface of materials. The surface is mainly only a portal to the substance, what is underneath the surface. Looking at each other as we do, we really want to know what is behind the face in front of us, what is under the clothes, if you like, but at least what is beyond the vision of the surface. Every centimetre of material, every single millimetre of material is a result of a balanced equation. Flaws, fingers, there are no lumps in the air. In much of my work, Rational Beings, I have used geometries as internal formal constructions so that the external appearance of the work is the result of this internal structure. I don't throw things at the wall in the hope of demonstrating my emotionality and in the hope of achieving some intense chance effects. Although that is also an illusion, because when you do throw things, paint at the wall, it does exactly the same things. It follows certain laws and always make exactly the same patterns. I want to make work that has the same intense effect on me that looking at nature does. In doing this, I've become aware of how increasingly rational constructions take on an emotional quality. Sculpture and art generally are rare uses of material, and it gives new forms that are not driven by utilitarianism, but by aesthetics and imagination. If our obsession with simple solutions has resulted in dumb simplicity in our education and social systems, agriculture, forestry, architecture, urban planning, and media, art allows us to see the world through another individual's eyes, their abilities, concerns, and perspectives. And the exciting thing about art is that we never know what it would look like tomorrow. I believe that art has made a very significant contribution. I'm a sculptor, a radical materialist, and so I can say to you all from the bottom of my heart, make the best of it.